welcome. This really, as I said before, this is really an honor. This button that I'm wearing is available at the swag table at the front check-in. You can get buttons with these people on them. So, I mean, they're big-time celebrities. It's a big deal. So, we may know them. If you are familiar with them, you know that it's the Tinker name that is on the famous US Supreme Court case. But today I want to talk a little bit about what led up to that and what you have learned since then. So there was the famous US Supreme Court verdict, but a lot happened before and a lot has happened since. So why don't we just start, just give us a little bit of background about what your lives were like before you became famous. Where were you living and what was life like for you?
Okay. Well, first off, thank you all for being here this afternoon. It's great to see a lot of people interested in history. And I'll tell you a little about ourselves. We are Iowans. We lived in Atlantic, Iowa. We lived in Wapello, Iowa. Do you know Wapello on the eastern side of the state? And then Atlantic on the western side of the state. In the early 1950s, we lived in Atlantic. And I was just a little kid, and Mary Beth was even littler. Our father was a Methodist minister at the church there in Atlantic, and times were different back then. There was one black family in Atlantic, and they were not allowed to use the swimming pool. So when the Methodist Youth Fellowship group found out about that, they thought they should try to do something about that it wasn't just. And so they took the issue to the city council, and the city council said, no, we don't really want them to swim in the swimming pool. And the board of the church, where our father was the minister, said that raising that issue was divisive in the community, and that the minister of a church should not be doing that. And that really broke our father's heart, and he was asked to move to another church here in Des Moines. And so in 1957, we moved to Des Moines. And at that point, our parents, especially our mother, was very interested that we have black people in our lives. And she made friends with another name you may well be familiar with, Edna Griffin, also from Des Moines. And so we grew up as friends with the Griffin children, Stanley and Phyllis and Linda. And we invited them to come to church with us on Sunday. And that caused also some trouble at that church. And so our father was asked again to leave the church, to find another church. And by that time, our father was pretty discouraged with that, and he got a job working for the Quakers, for the American Friends Service Committee. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but they have an office on 42nd and Grand. So for a number of years, he was the Peace Education Secretary for the American Friends Service Committee. When the war in Vietnam was increasing in violence, and the bombing especially began in February of 1965, it was called Operation Rolling Thunder. Big B-52 airplanes dropping bombs on really a third world country, a primitive situation. It horrified us. And so one thing led to another. We went to a big demonstration in Washington. And on the way back from that demonstration, there was a discussion of how we would continue to oppose the war in Vietnam. And this was in December of 1965, a long time ago. We decided to wear armbands to school. And one of our members of our little group wrote an article for the Roosevelt High School newspaper explaining what we were doing. And when his faculty advisor found out about it, he took the matter to the principal at Roosevelt. The principal at Roosevelt called the other principals in town, and they had a meeting, a secret meeting, and they decided to ban the wearing of armbands. And so basically we decided to wear them anyway. And we got kicked out of school. We weren't sure what to do. A lawyer from Drake University thought that we did have a constitutional issue, and he recommended that we go back to school without our armbands on so that we wouldn't be truant and complicate the matter with truancy, and then sue. He recommended that we sue the school board in the federal court for a violation of our constitutional rights. So that's what we did. And we actually lost in the first court here, the district federal court here in Des Moines, and we appealed to the appellate court in St. Louis. And there, a funny thing happened. They were short a judge, so they only had 8 instead of 9. And those 8 judges split 4-4. And so that really set it up perfectly to go to the Supreme Court, because the judicial system wasn't sure what to make of this case. Do students have a right to non-disruptively, we didn't say a word, we just wore the black armband. Do they have a right, do students have a right to express their thinking in the public schools? And the Supreme Court heard the case, and the Supreme Court decided 7-2 in our favor. And so that became the basis for what's now pretty well known in the school systems, the Tinker v. Des Moines decision. And it's created what they call the Tinker standard. Sometimes they call it the Tinker test. And that standard is that if it's not, it has to be a substantial and material disruption for the school authorities to interpose and to prohibit the expression. And so that ruling happened in February of 1969, and since then it's become the leading precedent for student expressive rights in the public schools. And I'll just, I know Mary Beth agrees with me about this. We are really proud to be associated with the case. But the case was much bigger than us. It involved the ACLU. It really involved support from the whole Iowa peace community and the civil liberties community, which is really strong. And so we're both honored and privileged to represent the case and to have been part of it.
Thanks, John. It's so good to be here with all of you as we talk about these issues through history and how young people have stood up and spoken up, which you have. All of you young people. Where's our young people? Yeah, all right. You standing up? Are you standing up and speaking up? Yeah, sometimes. Yeah, good. Young people all through history have spoken up for a better world, for equality and justice and all of those values that we say that we're about in our country and that we are about. And also young people have spoken up for love and for understanding and for a better world. But it doesn't always make you so popular when you do that. And sometimes it can be pretty unpopular.
I have a question on that. When your family was deciding to go through with this protest, how much of it was your decision and how much of it was adults around you who were nudging you in that direction?
We were very influenced by our society and including the adults in our lives, including our family. And we were very much influenced by our parents. My dad was a huge example, and also our mother, for standing up for justice and for equality. Because my dad, being a preacher, he didn't think it was right to just preach on Sunday. He said, no, you should also go out in your daily life and live these values that you say you're about, like understanding and love and equality and brotherhood. And so he believed in putting his values into action on earth. And so, yes, we were very much influenced by Not only our parents, but other adults also. But we also had our own ideas. A lot of people want to think that kids don't have their own ideas. What do you say, kids? Do you have your own ideas? Yeah, definitely. I know. Kids have a lot. Now I'm a pediatric nurse and I work with kids. And I know that you have wonderful ideas and a lot of great ideas. But if you don't have your rights, you can't express your ideas. So this is a children's rights issue, an international human rights issue of young people being able to express themselves.
Remind us again how old you were when all of this played out.
When this happened, I was 15 years old, and Mary Beth was 13 years old. Thank you. About the question of how much influence did the adults have? The adults in our life, our parents, as Mary Beth said, had quite a bit of influence around our basic family values. We believed in what they now call social justice. We believed that people of all races had the same rights, and people of all income levels also had the same rights. And we really did get those values from our parents. And also from the society at large, I'd have to say. When I was in school, we were taught regarding freedom of speech that I may not agree with what you say, but I will defend your right to say it. And that's the real fundamental principle behind freedom of speech. But I also want to say that this was not originally a freedom of speech matter for us. It was an anti-war matter. We were primarily opposed to the death and destruction that we were seeing on a daily basis on the television screen. And of course, we are civil libertarians. We believe strongly in civil liberties. But we were using our civil liberties on behalf of another issue that we really cared about a lot. To the question of our parental influence, basically what happened was there were offers made to represent us in court. And so it came to us kids as, this offer's been made, do we want to do it? Our parents checked it out with us. Do you want to pursue this? Do you want to go? And from my point of view, it was like anything we can do to bring more publicity regarding the war, we want to do. Again, it was not primarily looked at, from my point of view, as a civil liberties matter, but as an anti-war matter. But in each case, our parents, we shared their values, but they did not push us into this thing. The wearing of the armbands really was organized by a youth group. It was the actual group of kids that wore the armbands in the schools were all associated with the Unitarian youth group. I was part of it, and others were too. And the kids organized it. The parents supported us. That was one difference really that we had. Some of the kids in our group did not have their parents supporting them, but we did, and Chris Eckhart did too. Both the four parents involved were very strong anti-war people and civil liberties people. So,
when you visited in the fall for the kickoff, the National History Day kickoff, you described the scene when you were called into the principal's office. What did that feel like? And it was such a great description of that scene. Just take us through what was going through your head and then what happened with the principal.
I was nervous. I mean, that's understandable, I think. You're called into the principal's office and you've really never been in trouble, and actually you're considered to be a pretty good student, and suddenly you're called into the principal's office. Mr. Wetter was the principal at North High at the time, and it was an amazing experience for me too, because Mr. Wetter did not threaten me. He didn't call me a coward. He didn't call me a communist. He thought maybe I had been listening to some bad advice. He himself was a Korean War veteran, and he thought that it was important in a time of war that the citizens support their government. And he ran that by me, and I explained my point of view, and we talked for about 45 minutes. But it was a respectful discussion. It wasn't antagonistic. And finally he said, well, I'm going to ask you to take the armband off, and if you take it off, you can just go back to class, and it'll be just like it never happened. And then he said, but I don't think you're going to take it off, are you? And I said, no, I'm not. And years later, I look back at that, and I thought, what a beautiful thing for him to have said to me, that he felt that my own sense of personal integrity and my conscience would not really permit me to take that armband off. He was really showing respect for me. And anyway, that's my feeling that I have for Mr. Wetter, for Don Wetter.
Can you imagine talking with the principal for 45 minutes? I mean, wouldn't you start to get a little bit nervous? I want to talk to you both to get your sense, if you remember, during this whole process, you kept going to school and it was in the news. Were there people that you remember supporting you and people who criticized you, either teachers or other classmates? Do you remember supporters and critics during this process?
Yes, I remember people that were supportive. One of them was a Marine corporal in the Marines who wrote an article to the Des Moines Register. And he said, basically, wait, now, this is why I'm in the Marines, because I believe in democracy, and I believe in the First Amendment. I believe the kids should be able to express themselves. And so that was very heartening. The Des Moines Register in general, they also wrote an editorial in our favor. And the school board also had some people that voted for us on the Des Moines School Board, but there were also people in the community that were supportive. And we even got letters from around the world. Mm-hmm. After we won the case, I remember a letter from a man in Nigeria who said, thank you, kids, for speaking up for peace and for expressing your views in your schools. It's very important for kids to speak up and stand up.
Yeah, I also had a mix. I had a lot of friends who did actually support what I was doing. I had other friends who didn't really agree with me about the war, but that thought that it was right, that I had the right to do what I was doing. I'll just describe one incident. The day I wore the armband, I had it at the time in the lunchroom over a white shirt. It stood out very prominently at that point. And I was having lunch with my friends, and some kids came by and really started giving me a hard time, calling me a coward and a commie and this. And a football player came by, Steve Klein, if any of you know Steve Klein. Anyway, he was a North High football player. And he came by and he said to the kids that were hassling me, he said, look, you have your opinion about the war, John has his opinion, and John has a right to his opinion, so just leave him alone. And I was flabbergasted, honestly. I knew Steve slightly, but to have a football player, a jock, come over and defend you is a wonderful feeling, actually. So.
Do you remember teachers who gave you a bad time or grown-ups who didn't agree with you and let that be known?
Mostly my teachers mostly ignored it. One time after we were proceeding with the court case, I was one teacher kind of hurt my feelings, my social studies teacher, I think it was, because he said, oh, kids, this weekend we're having a big pep rally. Oh, but Mary Beth, I guess you have more important things to do, so it's just kind of a little dig at me. But mostly my teachers just pretty much ignored it, which was really strange after we won the case. Thinking back now, I thought it was kind of strange that one of the teachers didn't say, hey, kids, something kind of interesting happened to Mary Beth yesterday, but mostly I think they just didn't really know what to make of it.
I had teachers on both sides of the issue. I had two in particular that were very supportive. One of them was very supportive, and the other was non-committal, but he offered me probably 3 or 4 opportunities to come to talk to his class, his social studies class, about the war and about the protest against the war. The other teacher, John Phillips, I don't know if this rings any bells with people, he passed away just 6 months ago or so. Anyway, John Phillips told me that I was supposed to get a B in his class, but that he was going to give me an A in his class because he knew that there were other teachers that were grading me down. But the main thing that I like to point out is it was mixed. There was a mixed bag. It wasn't all hostile. There were a lot of people out there willing to defend me and willing to support me, not necessarily because they agreed with me about the war, but just in the principle of democratic rights and free speech.
Yeah, some people really believe in the First Amendment. A lot of people in our country cherish the First Amendment, the right to free speech, the right to petition, the right to assemble, the right to a free press, the right to have any religion that you want. And these are very cherished values, and it helps us to deal with controversy with each other with respect. It's a guide for how to be respectful to each other when we have disagreements.
How much personal interaction did you have with the courts? Did you get to go to the Supreme Court? Did you know how your case was doing as it made its way to the Supreme Court?
We did pretty much follow. We went to the appeals court. We testified in court at the lower levels, and it was really nerve-wracking, definitely for me. I was in 8th grade. I was 13 years old when it started. It was really nerve-wracking. I was so shy. And then I did go to the Supreme Court. John missed the plane to the Supreme Court, but I did go there, but I barely remember it because I was really upset about moving to a new city. I had just moved to a new city, St. Louis. And so my mind was really on that, and so I barely remember being at the Supreme Court.
Why did you miss your plane?
Why did you miss your plane, John?
Well, I flew out of Cedar Rapids. It was an 11 p.m. flight, and I'd been up since early morning. So when I got to the terminal waiting for the plane, I fell asleep. And now this is
Take a
the
stand.
last terminal.
Take a stand in history, guys.
Yeah, this was the last terminal, the very end of the building. Rows of chairs and bunches of people sitting there. And when I woke up, I was the only one sitting there, and I couldn't believe that they would leave me like that. I mean, somebody could have woke me up. I don't know. I had long hair. I had a little scraggly beard at the time. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but anyway, that's how I missed my plane. And then I flew standby the next morning, and I got bumped off of a standby flight. Do you know about standby? It's like you get a provisional ticket. If there's room, then you can fly. Well, there wasn't room. And so when I finally arrived in Washington, D.C., it was already 5 p.m., and it was all over. So maybe, would they have ruled differently if they would have seen me in the audience? I don't know.
How did you hear the verdict? I mean, now we would just hear about it on Twitter or online. How did you hear the news?
I got a phone call. By then I was a student at the University of Iowa, and a phone call came into our dorm room, and answered it. The reporter from the Daily Iowan said, "I've just discovered that you've won your Supreme Court case. How do you feel about it?" And I remember I said, "Well, I'm glad." But actually we were very happy. It was somewhat mitigated by the fact that the war was still going full steam. And even though we had won on the civil liberties aspect, we hadn't really put a dent really in the war effort.
Yeah, we had really mixed feelings. We were glad that we won and that we were able to express ourselves in the schools, but we were very sad about what was going on in the Vietnam War, because 1968 and 1969 were two of the worst years in the war. And I was just speaking on a panel with some Vietnam veterans, and we were talking about those years in the war, and probably some of you have experiences with the war. I'm sure some of you have yourselves. So it was hard to be real happy about the victory at the Supreme Court when the war was raging.
I want to fast forward a little bit and just discuss a little bit how you think things might have played differently today when students who are 15 and 13 have social media and can organize a protest much differently than you could with black armbands. How do you think it might have played out differently?
Well, it is playing out differently. It's playing out in very interesting ways. There is a girl named Sarah Kavanaugh, I think in Mississippi, who found out that there was a toxic chemical in Gatorade called brominated vegetable oil. So she started an online petition. She got 250,000 signatures. And Gatorade took that out of Gatorade. You can't find it in there anymore. And there were so many other student protests, whether it's around the oil pipelines for clean water, clean air, some of the campaigns against racism in the United States that students have organized, the Black Lives Matter, and so many other things that social media has really helped them do that. But students are speaking up and standing up about so many different things all over the country. I mean, there are kids who have worn red armbands to protest abortion, and they were told by their school that they couldn't do that. Well, they were able to do that because of the Tinker ruling. There are kids that have spoken up for gay rights, kids that have stand up against gay rights in their schools in various ways, and against dress codes, against yoga pants, for hats in school, for all different kinds of things. And I think the Tinker ruling has helped them do that, although there have been cases since ours that also cut back on the rights of students.
Yeah, I'm not surprising anybody with this information, but it's a very complex world out there. There are a lot of wonderful things about it, and there are a lot of horrible things going on. And it's impossible for anybody to really comprehend the totality of what's out there and how things happen and what causes what. We, in our wildest dreams, we would never have imagined that here we'd be 50 years later on a stage talking to people about our Supreme Court case. We didn't imagine it at all. And it was this series of events happen in a certain way, and things fall, the dominoes fall, pieces fall into place, and there you have it. Finally, it happens. But you couldn't have planned it, and you couldn't have predicted it. And a lot of life is like that. A lot of life is that you have to look at things that are happening and try to see them as well as you can, and then make your best decision as well as you can, and without really knowing how it's going to come out. And really that's what we were doing. We were following our conscience on a day-to-day basis, and that got us into the situation, and it turned out that we had sufficient support from the right places. We had a woman, Louise Noun, and her brother actually funded our case. And the support that we got from the Iowa Civil Libertarians and the peace movement, it all just worked together. And that's why I'm saying we're honored, and we feel really privileged to be in this position and to be able to discuss with you all what happened. And anyway, you can't make it happen. You can only just do your best, basically, and that's what we were doing.
You mentioned, in some ways the world is very more complicated, and it's very complex. And with social media, we're just bombarded with information and causes. You can go on Facebook and find lots of different causes. What advice would you give to students who want to make a difference, do you have criteria, or how do you choose what cause to support? What advice would you give to students who want to take a stand, and they don't know what cause to choose, or how do you jump into that?
Well, maybe there's something that you care about, some issue that you care about. I mean, I always tell the students, it's the same basic strategy whether you want to change the rule at your school for no hats, or whether you want to change, the air quality in Iowa. Find a few people that care about that issue also, and join together with them and see what's already going on in that area. And then you can, join up and be very creative. There were some students in Rhode Island recently, and they were really tired of all the tests all the time in their schools. So they dressed up like guinea pigs and rats. And they went off to the Rhode Island legislature, and they said, no, we should not have another test yet added to all the tests that we already have tested. And so the legislator put a hold on the graduation requirement. They're going to require another standardized test. But I mean, there's so many creative things that kids are doing all over the country and all over the world. And definitely in Iowa. There was a teen conference here in Iowa, in Des Moines, that I was at called RISE last summer. And the students were speaking up about so many things and joining together on so many issues that they cared about to make a better world. We don't need more hate in the world. We need more understanding and more, caring and ways to talk about things with each other with respect.
The thing that I really think is important when you're entering into a potential conflict situation, is to do your best to be sure of your own position, and to have considered it and reconsidered it and pretty much try to know it inside out. And in terms of the parts of what you're going to be doing that are going to appear offensive to other people, examine how much of it is really necessary. Do you really need to offend people over some particular detail or not? Or is there a workaround that doesn't compromise your point, but still can avoid conflict where possible? Because if you're really trying to change something and to set a new standard somehow, it's going to have to clear a lot of hurdles, because people who are your opponents, they have reasons for why they think the way they do. And if you just butt heads with them, it's not going to have a positive outcome. You really need to consider your opposition. You need to find what agreement you can establish with your opposition. What values do you share with your opposition? And it always helps if you enter with those. For instance, when we wore the armbands, I know every one of us put on our Sunday best clothing, because we didn't want to come across as just rebels. A lot of people were already telling us that we were publicity seekers for being protesters and so on. They don't say that so much anymore, but back then it was a big thing. And so by dressing nicely for the times and so on, it's like a way of saying we're not against your culture. We're not against society. We're not against the country. We are patriots in our own view. We see ourselves as patriots in what we're doing. But anyway, consider your position. Don't compromise the important thing, but try to bring it to the crux of the matter. Because if you can establish that in a fair light, then that's how you're going to get your change.
I have one more question, but then I want to open it up to questions among the audience, because I know you have some good ones, and some of you know their stories really well. We just hit the 50th anniversary, right, of
It was the 50th anniversary of getting suspended
Okay.
last December.
Something to celebrate.
And in
I don't
2
know
years
what kind of cake you get for
yeah,
that.
you get a great cake. And then in 2 years, we're coming back to Des Moines for the 50th anniversary of the ruling in the case.
And what festivities are planned for that?
Well, we're working on it now. We're putting it together. We're going to be going into some of the different schools and maybe working with the Historical Society. Maybe we'll work with you on it, Michael. How about it?
Yeah, we're up for it.
All
We're
right,
up
thanks.
for it. I want to ask, though, looking back 50 years, what are some things that you understand now, looking back, that you had no idea that it would evolve into how it shaped your life, or what you have learned from the long view? Are there things that are takeaways that you couldn't possibly have imagined when you were going through it?
I've learned that children and teenagers all through history have spoken up and made a difference in our world. I mean, the first factory workers were kids. And they had the Factory Girls Association that Hannah Hansen, I mean, they stood up for themselves. They stood up for their rights in all different ways. The kids in Birmingham stood up against racism and the KKK. They risked their lives against the KKK in Birmingham, and I know some of you did projects on that. I'm so happy that all of you are studying about all of this history. That's the main thing that I've learned, is that young people have been standing up and speaking up a lot through history, not just in our country, not just in Iowa, but all over the world. And it has led to us having a better world. And now kids are doing it again. Kids are speaking up so much today for a better world, for equality, for justice, and for a better world.
I guess one thing I've come to realize is that there's a lot of support out there that you may not realize is there. That what we were doing, the civil liberties thing with the freedom of speech, the First Amendment, there is a huge amount of support for that out there. And we were maybe the incident. We were the symbol of these kids doing a nonviolent, non-disruptive, pure political speech opposing a war. It was, in a lot of ways, it was far more ideal than I would have thought that I would ever be a part of anything. It was a very clean case in a lot of ways, but it attracted a huge amount of support. We had lawyers all over the country that believed in what we were doing, and anyway, that's coming from being a kid, 16, 17, well, starting when I was 15, and feeling really isolated, especially with an anti-war view when it wasn't a popular view. But when even if you're only 1% or 5% of the population, forgive me, of Des Moines, that believe in a certain way about the war or about civil liberties or whatever, you put that together across the whole country and you've got huge numbers of people that really do agree with you. There's support. You don't need to feel isolated. And no matter what your issue is, I can guarantee you that there's support out there for it if you can find it. And in our case, the support found us.
All right, thank you. Who has a question out there? I'm gonna run this microphone around as much as I can.
Great.
And
Questions.
here's some Luther College.
Do you want to
grads
holler them
here.
out? Does someone want to stand up and yell out your question?
yeah, I
Stand
saw a
up.
hand
Take a
over
stand.
here.
Now's your chance. Take a stand. All right.
First of all, I want to thank you because over the years you have allowed my students to interview you. I even came to a snowstorm in Des Moines last year with a student. So I appreciate your graciousness and your willingness to put up with all these kids asking questions.
It's fun.
I know it is. And I get so, they will tell you my nerd comes out every time they get to interview you. But I do have a question for you. When you chose to wear the black armbands, if you would have gone into school and caused a commotion, caused a disturbance, how would that have played out differently?
Well, our case, the substantial disturbance part in the ruling, which says that students do have First Amendment rights, but they cannot make a substantial disruption. That comes directly from Mississippi Freedom Summer. And I saw an exhibit on Ella Baker there from the Mississippi Freedom Summer. Students there protested the murder of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman by the Ku Klux Klan. 3 young people were killed in Mississippi in 1964. And the Ku Klux Klan murdered them. And so students wore buttons to school to protest that, and they were suspended from school. And at the appeals court there in Mississippi, they said, no, those students should have had a right to wear those buttons to protest the murder of those 3 young people because they did not substantially disrupt school. And so in the ruling in our case, they cited that case. It's called Burnside. So that whole standard of students not being able to substantially disrupt school, and now it's being extended to out-of-school speech too. The issue now is how can things that you say out of school, can the school discipline you for that? And pretty much lately the courts have been saying yes, that if something you do out of school disrupts school, there's a pretty good chance that the school will be able to censor your speech or discipline.
Yeah, I think things would have gone completely different. Something would have happened, but not what did happen. But also, it was the furthest thing from our mind. We had no notion of causing trouble. We were interested in persuading people to take a look at the war and to consider our point of view on the war. We were not interested in offending people at all.
I saw a question up here, yes, in the striped shirt.
Okay, well, mine's not necessarily a question, but like it's a comment. In my school, we were learning about First Amendment rights in like school, and your guys' case came up, and I always kind of wanted to do like a civil rights movement, but I wasn't necessarily sure how I was gonna do it because school is basically my life because I'm a teenager. But like, since we were learning about it, and I was like, okay, so if I can do it in a peaceful manner, and then I can actually do it. So I wanted to say thank you for inspiring me.
Thank you. Thank you. What are you doing your peaceful action about? What issue do you care about?
Well, it's a group called Alliance, and we wear rainbow pins, and it supports LGBT plus rights and diversity, and it's just spreading a bunch of love instead of hatred.
Well, that's good. I'm glad you're standing up for your beliefs. Good going. All right. And by the way, if you wanted to, like a boy came up to me recently and said, I don't support gay rights, and he said, do I have a right to say this in school? Does he have a right to say that in school? Yes, because of the First Amendment, right?
Why did you choose to do a black armband instead of like a red or green or blue?
Well, I just found this out recently. After the children were killed in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, a man named Bayard Rustin wrote a letter with a writer named James Baldwin. And they said what we should do to mourn the death of these 4 little girls who were killed also by the Ku Klux Klan in 1963, we should wear black armbands around the country. And people should have mourning services to say that they're mourning, that they're sad about the little girls getting killed in Birmingham that year. And so the idea spread around the country. And there was a mourning service right here in Des Moines where people wore black armbands. And that was in 1963. So the idea was kind of floating around because of that, and also because black armbands are a symbol of mourning, of sadness that go back through history.
See, now I just learned that this very moment. I didn't know about. I knew that the black armbands were a traditional symbol of mourning. And do you know the old TV show called The Rifleman? Yeah, Chuck Connor. Anyway, it was a show we used to watch when we were kids, and sometimes more recently than that. But anyway, in one of the shows, there's a scene, and there's a guy walking across the street, and there's no comment made about it at all, but he's wearing a black armband. It was a traditional symbol that to put on your arm if one of your family members had died, you'd put on this black armband just to let society know that you were in a period of mourning. Often it would be done for 30 days or something like that. So it's really a traditional symbol. I did see a photograph of William Eckhart, who was the father of Chris Eckhart, one of the three of us in the case, and it was taken in 1963, and he did have a black armband on, and it was held up at the Capitol building here, and I think I may have taken the picture myself with my dad's camera, but there he is wearing a black armband, and that was several years before we wore our armbands.
Who's got another question? Yes.
Hi, I was wondering through the years if you've kept track of any of the cases where they have been ruled substantially disruptive. What kind of behaviors? In particular, I'm thinking of recently the National Day of Silence was just observed for LGBTQ plus members that have been silenced. And there was some discussion at our school whether silence was in fact substantially disruptive to the school day. Your thoughts?
A lot of this is up to the discretion of the principals and the school board. I was just talking to the National School Boards Association convention actually in Denver. And I mean, it varies between schools. What is substantial disruption and when, some principals let the students have walkouts after the election. And no student was suspended. Other students got in-school suspension at schools where I was. But a lot of it depends on the discretion of the staff and the principal. There's a very big case called Dariano in California where students were not allowed to wear American flags to school recently, in the last few years. Why? Because they wore them to mock the Mexican kids on Cinco de Mayo. And so the principal felt that he was predicting, because even if you can predict a substantial disruption, you have grounds to stop the student speech now, pretty much. And that is in the Tinker ruling. If you can even predict a substantial disruption. So the principal said, I'm predicting that there's going to be a substantial disruption over these flags. And he stopped them from wearing them. And it was appealed to the appeals court where the kids lost. John and I signed on to an amicus brief saying, don't censor the kids for wearing their American flags. Instead of censorship, let's have the students talk it out. Maybe have an assembly, have the kids with the American flags over here, the kids with the Mexican flags over here, and let's have some discussion and dialogue about it. But it is quite a bit up to the different schools, because what does that exactly mean, substantial disruption? It's kind of hard to pinpoint what it is.
The majority opinion in our case was written by Justice Abe Fortas. And I think he tried to insert some preventative in it against school administrations saying, well, we were afraid that there would be some disruption. And he said, Abe Fortas wrote, you have to accept that there's going to be some disruption because that's the way our society works. He said, often contentious society. When people are freely saying what they think, oftentimes there is disruption. And Abe Fortas said, we have to accept that there's going to be some disruption. And so that's why the Tinker Standard says substantial and material disruption. And I believe it's a preventative to keep the school administrations from just saying, well, we were afraid. No, you have to really have real reasons for that, and it has to be substantial, and it has to be material. It has to be something that really happens or really is very likely to happen. So anyway, the chilling effect of kids who would be under the thumb of an administration that says, well, that could be disruptive. If you did this, it could be disruptive. Suddenly you just have a dictatorship. And so the language in our case is very clear. It has to be a substantial and material disruption. And I think that's just excellent foresight on the case of Abe Fortas.
I'm curious, what was the basis for the dissent, the two dissenting justices in your case?
The dissent?
The basis, just to mention also briefly, the basis for students winning the right to express themselves in public schools was based on the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment. That's what the lawyers in our case are. But the dissent was based on the idea, it was Justice Black and Justice Harlan who argued that schools would become, just out of control if students had free speech rights.
We'll take about 3 more questions. One back here.
Was it hard or scary to walk into the school with the armbands?
Yes, it was very, very scary. And I was very shy. And I was so nervous, which is probably why when I went into the principal and the girls' advisor and they told me to take off the armband, that it's against the rules, I took off the armband. I was really scared and nervous. And to me, there's a lesson there that you can be a scared, nervous, person and just have about that much courage, and you can still make a difference.
Do you still have the armbands? Where are they now?
Well, strangely enough, when I went back to school that January, I had to write a report about what did you do over Christmas time. And so I pasted the armband in my report, and it's at a museum in Washington. It's at the Newseum in Washington, D.C. now.
Do you remember your grade on the paper?
No, but I did see some red marks on it. There's no grade, but there's some corrections on it. There's a whole display there on students' rights. It's very interesting if you can ever go to the Newseum. Probably a lot of you. Who's been to the Newseum? All of you history lovers out there. Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? It's a great place. And they've been a great supporter of our Tinker Tour as we travel around the country speaking about the First Amendment.
2 more questions. Oh, right here.
Did you have anybody in your family fighting in the Vietnam War, or was your protest purely just because you were against it?
We did not have anyone in our family fighting against the protest. Fighting in the Vietnam War. No, we did not. Mostly our motivation came from the students in our neighborhood who were being called up to war, and also by what we saw on the news, the terrible scenes of the bombings and the children running from their huts that were on fire, and the news. Really, our story is a story about journalism, the importance of the free press. Because if we wouldn't have seen the journalists and people like Walter Cronkite reporting on the war every night, we wouldn't have known what was going on in the war.
If I could just say, sometimes when you hear about the Vietnam War, people will talk about demonstrators spitting on troops. And personally, I never saw anything like that, and I was in a number of demonstrations, and we completely separated the troops from the foreign policy of the United States. We didn't accuse the troops of being part of the war. We saw the troops as victims of the war also. And actually, when the troops began to see themselves as victims of the war, fairly soon the war was over. And anyway, I had respect for what I saw as the poor kids that were being drafted. I was a conscientious objector when my draft number came up, so I wasn't drafted. But people I knew were drafted. And I didn't know anybody that was happy to be drafted. I'm sure there were people, that were happy to be drafted. But personally, I never really blame the people that get caught up in these horrible situations. To me, the responsibility should fall more with the leaders, with our political leaders, and with the citizens that let this thing happen, the voters that let it develop into that sort of a situation. But I just want to try to debunk slightly the spitting on the troops thing. If you hear that, just remember that somebody doesn't think that really happened too much. It might have happened once or twice, but it's been reported quite widely when you get into the history of the Vietnam War protests.
I don't know, John. I have talked to soldiers who say that they experienced that themselves, But I would like to add that a lot of times people say that there were the protesters, and that was a lot of students. And then there were the troops. But actually, the troops, a lot of the troops were protesting as well. There was a lot of overlap. There was on many, many Army bases, there were protests going on the bases themselves, and not just in the Army, but also in the Navy and all of the branches. So there was and I think that did have a lot of power in ending the war when the troops themselves, and veterans, the Vietnam veterans against the war. So many of the active soldiers and veterans became involved in the anti-war movement as well.
What was the most difficult thing for you guys during the whole process?
I'd say the most difficult thing was the haters. The haters came out of the woodwork, and they started threatening to blow up our house. And they called us communists, and my mom would always say, "We're not communists, we're Methodists." And they would throw red paint at our house, and they would send us hammer and sickle hate mail, and they would say, "Why don't you go back to Russia and to China?" And we would always think, "Wait, we're from Atlantic, Iowa. Why are we going to go back to?" So I'd say that was the worst thing. It was my first real experience with the dangerous, violent people out there that are like that. Of course, now they're coming out of the woodwork again. Now they're scrawling KKK on the sides of buildings, and they're putting swastikas around, and they're I just heard about a young black woman who was told to get out of this campus. We don't want you here. All kinds of haters are coming out of the woodwork again. So I guess now students have to stand up and speak up again.
I agree with that. It really is the hater or the hateful person. And honestly, they have small minds. They really do. And there's no chance that you're going to convince them of your point of view. And it's like when they put a brick through our Volkswagen windshield, it's like, what can you do? And you can't explain your position to them. It's like they just want to hate. And that's the most frustrating thing, is to have people like that around, and what can you do with them?
You have to give love. Give love. Keep giving love.
All right, that's a great note to end on. I want to remind you this discussion will be posted online at iowaculture.gov in a few days. We've been recording it, so teachers, if you want to use it in future lessons, students, if you want to revisit it and use it for quotes or whatever, it will be here. But let's just take a moment to thank them. What a great example of taking a stand in history.
And we would like to thank all of you too. And I know you're all excited about the results of your projects and everything. You did great work. We just were looking at some of the projects, and it's been wonderful to be here with all of you. Congratulations on a lot of really good work, and thank you to all the teachers who helped the students and parents and families as well. Thank you so much.
I completely second that. You're a great bunch.